Thank you all so much. It's really such an honor to be here. And Roberta, you're such an inspiration and role model, really combining a dedicated career of policy and the university and service. And so it's such an honor to give this lecture. And I'm also really honored to return to Madison. I think of it as the place where I had my intellectual and political coming of age. And I'm so appreciative for my work with Eric and my work at COWS. But it was my many years in Madison, probably at rallies and in the streets and protests, that really shaped a lot of what I work on today, and which really made me surprised I ever finished my degree here. So I'm lucky that I made it out, and that was with a lot of support from my faculty. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about tonight is looking at low-wage work. It's been 50 years since the US launched its war on poverty. And I think if we look back at that period, we can see the US really looked at poverty at that time as primarily an issue of unemployment, of people without jobs, and perhaps people marginalized or excluded by labor laws, farm workers and domestic workers, primarily black workers who were excluded in the labor force. Today, the poverty rate has dropped, although not by that much. It's gone from about 19% to about 15% of the population. But the absolute number of people living in poverty has gone up quite drastically. And one of the things we can see today is an increased awareness that to be in poverty might mean that you are working. It's not just those who are unemployed, but increasingly people who work are also living in poverty. So I think that what I want to focus on is understanding this notion of low-wage work, and understanding that the low-wage worker is not just marginal to our labor market, but actually represents some of the fundamental characteristics of our labor market and of our economy. So what I want to talk about tonight is first thinking about what is low-wage work, who are low-wage workers, what are their characteristics, and then thinking a bit about the causes underlying the persistence of low-wage work, and then finally think some thoughts about what we might do about it. So first of all, what is low-wage work? When we try and define it, there are a lot of different ways to define it. We can talk about a living wage, or we can talk about measuring poverty. There's no one right answer. In fact, countries differ a lot on how they define a living wage and how they define poverty. In the United States, we have a minimum wage, a federal minimum wage, that actually has no logic behind it whatsoever. It was just established in 1938 at 25 cents an hour, and then it's raised periodically when there's enough political will to do so, but with no logic behind it. It's not even necessarily raised for inflation at the federal level. So the minimum wage is relatively low. It hasn't been raised in many years. It's not keeping up with the cost of living. And we can look at the minimum wage as thinking about low-wage workers. In the last 20 years or so, we've also had living wage campaigns in many cities around the country. Over 125 cities have passed living wage ordinances. Most of those have defined a living wage as the hourly wage necessary for a full-time worker to reach the federal poverty line for a family of four. And that wage is not very high. And in fact, I'm going to pull up a chart here. So first I have on the first line is the federal minimum wage, which also happens to be the Wisconsin state minimum wage, $7.25 an hour. If a worker worked 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, that would amount to a gross of about $15,000 a year. The living wage, as measured by the poverty line for a family of four, would be $11.46 an hour for an annual income of $23,000, almost $24,000 a year. Now, a number of scholars have also developed methodologies to try and define a more realistic living wage. Most all scholars agree that the poverty line, the federal poverty methodology, is outdated. It doesn't adjust by region of the country. It doesn't adjust for the fact that people work. It was designed without thinking about things like childcare and transportation. So a more realistic living wage, there's different methodologies, but this is one by Dr. Amy Glassmeyer of MIT, comes up with the figure of just about $20 an hour for a family of four in Dane County, or an annual income of $41,500 a year. And that's just for covering the bare basics, not any luxuries, not eating out, just buying groceries that are a healthy diet. But whatever measure you use, you can see that low wage is common and persistent. Using this middle measure of the federal poverty line, right now in the United States, about 28% of our workforce earns poverty level wages. It's extraordinary. It's about 37 million people who are earning poverty wages. And this is the richest country in the history of the world, and we have 28% of our workforce earning these wages. The rates are even worse for certain groups if we look by race. Here's a chart that looks at the rates going back to the 1970s, and we can see for Hispanic workers, 43% are earning poverty wages, 36% of black workers. And you can also see from this chart that it's persistent. We've had some ups and downs, but low-wage work has actually been persistent in our economy for quite a while. The situation is actually even worse when you consider other factors. One of which is that these are assuming an outdated poverty measure, as I said, but they're also assuming looking at full-time work. And what we know is a lot of low-wage workers don't have access to full-time work, and they struggle to have enough hours of work. We've had an increase in what we call involuntary part-time work, workers who want full-time work but can't get it, and that has increased especially since the recession. I don't know how well you can see this, but we call this part-time for economic reasons, which happens to mean involuntary part-time. But that's that bottom line here is a big spike at the recession. So we have about 5 to 6% of our workforce that wants full-time work but can't find it. Involuntary part-time work is worse for young workers. It's also much worse in the service industries where over 11% of workers are involuntarily part-time. We've also seen an increase in non-standard shifts, workers that work night shifts or irregular shifts, and this is again low-wage workers are overrepresented in this group. We also see just an increase in insecurity, work insecurity in general, and this is whether it's temp work, seasonal work, contracted work. This is not just even about low-wage workers. This is moving throughout our labor force. Even in the most secure job that you can imagine, tenured professors, we're seeing a move from tenured faculty to adjunct faculty. This is an example of a move to insecure work. But even a full-time, unionized high-wage manufacturing worker may be working side by side with a subcontracted temp worker for half or less of the wage and no benefits. Public sector, high-wage, good job, right beside subcontracted part-time workers. So this all comes together to create a pretty grim picture for low-wage workers. And unfortunately, when we look ahead to the future, it doesn't look much better. When we look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics projections for job growth over the next 10 years, what we can see, the top 20 jobs that are growing the most jobs that are going to create about almost 50% of the new jobs in the economy. If we look at those, this goes on to 2 slides here, but there are only 2 of those occupations where the median income reaches that living wage that I put in the first chart, the $41,000 a year. Only 2 occupations, registered nurses and general and operations managers. 18 occupations have median incomes less than what we think of as a living wage. And even when we look at the poverty line, 7 of those occupations have median incomes below the federal poverty line. Again, this is actually worse than it looks. This is assuming full-time work, 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. In the service industries, about 40% of workers are part-time, so they're not making these. So this is actually worse than it seems. So if we look to our future, the future jobs to 2022, it looks pretty grim. We look like it's a future of low-wage work. I want to take a bit closer look at low-wage work by looking at retail workers, because I think to understand it, it's not just about the wages, but it's about kind of the daily experiences of workers on the job. Retail is an interesting industry because it's growing in many parts of the world. Many localities, as they've, governors, mayors have cut property taxes, cut income taxes for the wealthy, corporate taxes. They're turning to sales taxes as a way to generate income. And sales, and retail is a way to do that. Retail is expected to grow by about 12% in the US. It's one of the areas of job growth. I've been working with a group called the Retail Action Project, organizing retail workers in New York City, and a global union federation of retail unions called CUNY. And we're trying to track what's going on in retail. What do the jobs look like? It's not that it's ever been a great job, but conditions are clearly deteriorating. first of all, I just want to say a bit about retail workers. There's, I think, an assumption that these are mostly young people without a lot of education. They're doing this in high school. They're doing it, a little bit just when they're young to get some money. And that's not actually true. Retail workers are slightly younger than the US workforce overall, but the median age is 38 years old. And if you look here, retail workers by age, you can see the bulk of them are ages 25 to 44, that's 40%, and 45 to 64, 33%. So retail workers span the ages. They're older than you might think through what the media tells you. And they also have more education than you might expect. Overall, nationally, in 2010, 50% of retail workers had at least some college, 20% had an associate's degree or more. So this group has more college, has more education than you might think. Okay, so what we did in New York is we did interviews of workers in the large retail chain stores and in large department stores. We talked to 436 workers and try to get a sense of what's going on in their daily lives. And then we've been following up with some in-depth interviews to talk to them about those. So a couple of themes emerge. One of the first things that you see is that the issue of hours is pretty serious. A lot of workers report that they see jobs posted as full-time jobs, and when they go to interview, they're given a bait and switch and told, the full-time job's not available, we'll hire you, you need to start out on probation, working 8 hours a week, 2 4-hour shifts, so 2 days a week, for 2 to 3 months. It's 8 hours a week. You may be able to pick up extra shifts, but it's not guaranteed. So you can see quickly this is very difficult to make a living 8 hours a week. Many workers want full-time work that we talk to, and they're not able to get it. Some of them are able to pick up extra shifts and extra hours, but even then they're not considered full-time for the purposes of receiving benefits. So they work 2 to 3 months doing 8 hours a week, and then they might get moved up to permanent, which might mean 20 hours a week or 25 hours a week. So it's quite difficult for workers to make a living. And I forgot to show this slide, that even with the higher education in retail, you can see that the median hourly wage for all workers in the US is $16.87, but the retail jobs are all roughly around $8, $9, $10 an hour. It's a low wage occupation. And so to show this, we saw that out of our interviews, we found that the majority, 53%, were hired as part-time workers with a median of 26 hours a week, a median wage of $9.25. This is in New York City, mind you. And only 9% of them are receiving health benefits. Only 25% receive any paid days off or sick days. But things aren't much better for full-time retail workers in terms of receiving health benefits and wages. So it's not a great job in general, but particularly for part-time workers. Now, this relates to another situation, which is not just that the hours are low, but that they fluctuate. And this is what Anna Haley-Locke, our professor here, calls work hours insecurity. The notion that you can't predict the hours that you have from week to week. Many of the workers don't have a set schedule, only about 17% have a set schedule. Many of them want full-time work, as I said, but they can't get it. And they try and they ask and they're given kind of a runaround. So here's a quote from one of our interviewees. I went to 40 hours for about a year, but I was never full-time. I wasn't getting benefits or anything. When I said I wanted to be made full-time, they said my hours were going to be cut. So the workers sometimes get scheduled for on-call shifts, which means that they're on the books for working, but they have to call the night before, or even sometimes up to 2 hours before to find out if they have to work. And even then, when they come into work, they might be sent home early if sales are slow. And what we're seeing is that retailers are using labor as a way to keep costs low. We had seen this trend in just-in-time inventory, where retailers were trying to only have enough inventory on the shelves that they thought they could sell. Now they're treating workers in the same way. They maintain a very large pool of available workers, but they only schedule the minimum they need on the floor. They track their sales, they track the weather, they track the customer flow, even down to hourly sales. And we heard workers that said, If my manager's not meeting their hourly sales goals, they send us home. Or they say if it starts to rain hard and it's flooding in front of the store, they send us home. What this does is it shifts the risks of employment from the employer onto the worker. So it's now the worker who bears the costs of whether the weather's bad or whether sales is slow. It's no longer the employer. And the employers don't want to hire workers that don't say that they're available full-time. They want to only hire workers that are available full-time so that they can be on call. And here's another quote. At a job interview, the manager specifically said he doesn't like hiring people with kids. They're a liability. Your kid gets sick, you can't come in, simple as that. Something happens to your kid at school, you have to leave. The employers don't want to deal with that, and it makes it very hard for workers with kids, with second jobs, or with college commitments to maintain the balance. This is work hours insecurity. Okay, so related to that, we also find that workers feel that this is very arbitrary. They don't understand the rules. They don't get who necessarily gets more hours. Sometimes they're pitted against each other to compete for hours. Hours is treated as a bonus, something you have to work for. And that you might be penalized for any reason. They hire lots and lots of people, so if you do something wrong, you could be out. Now, like I said, only 17% of workers have a set schedule. Only 30% know their schedule more than a week in advance. 53% know their schedule less than a week in advance. And by that, that might mean the night before. They may get their schedules on Thursday for a work week that starts on Friday. So you can see the challenges of scheduling your life. Okay, and in terms of an arbitrary schedule, one worker said, my hours are set on how they thought my performance was. It would be determined by a lot of things, how you close, if you come in on time. Say you missed work one day last week, even if it's because of an emergency, they'll cut your hours the next week. And another, I called out once and they took away my Monday shift. So you can see this insecurity, this arbitrary. Okay. In addition to that, we also find that it's a low-wage job and there's also few rewards in terms of raises and promotions. Now, I don't want to present this as entirely bleak. Many workers say they like working in retail because they like helping people and they like working with the public. They enter retail because they want to be in the field. They just find that they can't really advance and there's really nowhere to go with a career. And you can get a sense here, no, they don't give any raises there ever. We're not supposed to talk about raises. They ask you, are you a team player? If you're a team player, you're not supposed to ask about anybody's rate of pay, so we don't discuss it. Another person, I started at $7.25 as a visual. They display the clothes on the mannequins. Then it went to $7.50. Then after being there for 3 years, they promoted me in January 2013 to full-time, $8 an hour. And again, I'm reminding you this is in New York City with the extremely high cost of living. We also tried to track where people went over time in their careers, and we looked at their wage differences by race and tenure on the job. So we saw that workers all started relatively low. This is the top line is white workers, then black workers, then Latino. They are all starting low, although white workers higher than the others. After 6 months, white workers experienced raises. Actually, all groups did, but you can see that the lines are much flatter. Latino workers going from $8.75 to $9.75 after 2 years on the job. So this really, again, it's not looking like a career ladder. It's not a place to stay. Okay, even with these low wages, we're also finding evidence of what we call stolen time or wage theft, where employees are not even paid for all of the time that they work. They might be required to help customers on their break, or they might be able to do work before they clock in. A lot of workers reported this problem that they have to clock out and then get in line to be searched. All of the retailers search their employees and surveil them pretty heavily. They're under constant, the idea that they're stealing. So this worker says, we have to wear the clothes of the store. So we bring in bags to change. And this is a lot of the workers that work in high-end stores, then they can't afford the clothes. So they come to work and they might just change there. We clock out and then we have to get in line to have security check our bags. If a lot of people get off at once, we might have to wait 10 or 15 minutes. It might not sound like a lot, but when you're only working a 2-hour shift or a 3-hour shift and then you have to wait 15 minutes without being paid, it can add up. And this is one of the areas of wage theft. In addition, New York is one of the states, of 7 states only, that have reporting pay laws. New York actually mandates that workers be paid for 4 hours of work even if they're sent home early. But many workers do not know about this law. I didn't know about this law myself until I started studying it. And again, luckily Professor Haley Locke is doing a lot of interesting research on this, and she'll be able to present a lot of results on this. But it seems that it is not complied with in many states, and the penalties are very low. Okay, so a next trend that we find, this one I find fascinating, is the use of technology. These retailers are multi-billion-dollar global retailers using very high-end technology, fingerprinting to track when employees come in and out, sensors to track customer flow, to track when customers touch certain items in the store. They track, as I said, sales by the hour down to the minute. And yet, at the other end, in terms of scheduling, employees are still submitting their requests on paper sometimes, on an Excel spreadsheet. If they want to add more hours or change their shift, it's a paper. And they have to go into work to look at a paper posted on the bulletin board to find their schedule. Or they call a friend and ask, am I scheduled to work? So clearly the technology is there, it's available, it's used to make the employers' lives easier and not for the purpose of the employees. I found this interesting. They have sensors to track who comes into the store and who leaves with a purchase. They use this to track conversion rates. It's even more important than sales. Conversion always has to be 61% or over. Sometimes we walk across the sensors with products to keep the conversion rates high. So people are fighting back. They're trying to figure out ways around this. But you can see the technology is pretty sophisticated. And then the last issue that comes up is really this issue of dignity and respect. And over again, workers say they just feel so disrespected. They go into this work because they like helping people, and they feel like their time is devalued. They're completely replaceable. They feel like meaningless cogs. Many of them said that the customers are difficult, but really it's their treatment by management that is so demoralizing. Here's a quote. I work on the Upper West Side where everyone thinks they're entitled. I wish I could say the customers were meaner than the managers, but they're not. I can deal with a rude customer, I'm expecting that, but the manager is more hurtful because I see them every day. They'd rather undermine you than the customers. So this notion that the customer is always right means the frontline retail worker is always wrong, and that's what eats at their dignity on a daily basis. So what we kind of get at is a picture here. It's not just about the wage itself and the income, but there's a whole comprehensive picture of a job that is a dead-end job, disrespectful, demoralizing, dehumanizing. And that, I think, is why we need to think of low-wage work as something much more broader about, the whole humanity of the person. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the causes. What leads to this situation where we can have this kind of low-wage work, persistent low-wage work? I think there's some common things, stories that you'd read in the press, like the tropes that we hear. One is that it's the recession. This is cyclical. We get low-wage work during a recession. But you can see from the charts I put up earlier, this is pretty persistent. We have some ups and downs, but low-wage work has been around. Many of the patterns that we see now have persisted long before the current recession, and clearly they're persisting after, even when our economy is supposedly doing better. Another explanation is that it's about education and training. Workers are not getting the right education for this new global economy. But there's a few problems with that. The political science Gordon Lafer did a study. He looked at in the 1990s when we had very low unemployment for a period, and he found even then the number of workers who needed a living wage job, who could have got training for a better job, there was 26 million people where there was only 2 million jobs available, a gap of 24 million. This is not a gap that we fill by just those workers, those 26 workers getting better training. Clearly there's something structural underneath that. And in fact, if we go back and look at our occupations that are growing, 15 of them only require a high school degree or less. These are not jobs, the growth jobs are not high education level jobs. Only one of them requires a bachelor's degree. And in terms of work experience, only one requires prior work experience. Most of them require no job training or only short-term job training. So job growth is not in jobs that require high education and training. Our third explanation is often around who's deserving. And this is perhaps one of the disturbing aspects. Even some of our own campaigns, living wage, minimum wage campaigns, we tend to highlight workers who work full-time, hardworking families, they deserve a higher wage. this kind of poses us against as if other people are lazy and don't deserve a higher wage. And I always think about the 2006 City of San Francisco voters overwhelmingly approved a citywide minimum wage, raising the minimum wage for all workers in the city. On that same day, they passed a law criminalizing panhandling. And this has actually been a trend over the last 15 years. Cities are trying to raise wages, and they're also criminalizing poverty and homelessness. So we have this understanding of the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. And you could even say you see some of that in our immigrants' rights movements, where some of the most success has been with the Dreamers, who many of the stories say, oh, these poor students came here through no fault of their own. So we kind of emphasize they're the deserving immigrants versus the other undeserving. So I think that what's important is both around the deserving and the education angle is it really individualizes the problem of low-wage work. It says it's about a good person or a bad person, a lazy person or hardworking, someone who was smart enough to get the right education. And in fact, Gordon Lafer says that as a country, we went from a public commitment to job creation and full employment to shifting to job training. And we've changed it from a societal collective problem to an individual problem. This is not an individual problem. When you have 37 million people in low-wage work, this is not a problem that individuals can solve. This is a societal problem that requires a collective solution. Okay, a few other explanations then that we hear. It's globalization. It's deindustrialization, there's changing demographics, deunionization. These are all somewhat part of the problem. There's something to each one of these. But again, the way we hear it talked about suggests that these were just inevitable, that this was just going to happen. The world is now, we have the internet, so the world's global. So we have low-wage workers. And what they do is really ignore the fact that all of these trends are situated on political struggles, that there is a power struggle here between employers and workers, between corporations and citizens. It wasn't inevitable. We did lose as the working people, as the working class. We've lost on a lot of this. But it suggests that there's a fight to be had and that these trends are not necessarily have to happen. It's not just that unions, that people don't want to join unions. It's that unions have been viciously attacked by employers and governments. It's not just that technology has come about. It's that we invest in technologies to help employers and not in technologies to help workers. We promote things that we think are profitable. So I think we need to understand this as larger trends. And again, it's not just demographic changes. It's not that there's more immigrants here in the United States and worldwide because people want to move. We've had trade policies that kick people off of their homelands and push them out of their own countries. We have foreign policies and wars. So these are behind the changes. They're not inevitable. And again, I want to just take a little bit closer look at the retail industry to see how some of these forces have unfolded. We've seen the emergence of these mega chains, these international corporations. It's not just Walmart, it's Tesco, Carrefour, Target, and so forth. They're not new. We had chain stores going back to the 1800s. But when chain stores really started to grow in this country in the 1920s, governments and social movements responded, and they put regulations in place. They put restrictions on how big the stores can grow. They used antitrust regulations to keep them from dominating markets. And they enforced, to some extent, labor laws that required these employers to treat their workers with some respect. This begins to change, and in the 1980s we see in particular a change in antitrust laws where we no longer can really enforce, it's very difficult to enforce antitrust regulations against these retailers unless it's harming the ultimate consumer. So the retailers are allowed to go through massive mergers and acquisitions and grow to dominate markets, dominate market share. It's not just Walmart, it's throughout, for example, in office supplies. Staples, Office Max, and Office Depot all formed in the late 1980s. And by today, they control the majority of office supplies. Small and medium office supply stores only control 5% of the market. And that's true in most retail sectors. What these large corporations can do, they dominate the market to the extent that they can dictate the terms of their contracts with their suppliers around the world. And they can also set wages in labor markets in what we call monopolistic fashion. So it's not just that Walmart was smart. A lot of people think, oh, Walmart was so creative and clever, aren't they interesting? It's not that. It's that they grew at a time when the regulatory environment allowed them to grow in the way that they did. A&P and Woolworths tried to do what Walmart did 50 years ago, and they were stopped. They weren't allowed to grow to the size and dominance. People saw that as a threat not just to workers but to democracy. They thought that corporations of that size would impede in our basic citizenship rights. So we had laws that regulated corporations. Walmart grew in the US South in a very unregulated environment, or I should say it is regulated, but it's regulated in favor of workers at the in favor of employers at the expense of workers. Okay, so I think that what we can say is the current labor market wasn't inevitable. It represents a power dynamic between employers and workers, and it represents employers gaining massive power at the expense. Even Alan Greenspan, I think, saw this. In 1997, he was trying to understand why we saw unemployment going down but inflation wasn't going up. For many decades, economists thought that there was a trade-off between the two. And Greenspan said it's not just about this unemployment going down, but workers actually have to have the power to get higher wages. So he made this comment. In 1991, at the bottom of the recession, a survey of workers at large firms indicated that 25% feared being laid off. In 1996, despite the sharply lower unemployment rate and the tighter labor market, the same survey found that 46% were fearful of a job layoff. We've had decades of downsizing, of industrial restructuring, trade agreements that allow employers to threaten workers. They threaten to move overseas. All of this creates fear and insecurity. Workers are afraid to ask for raises. They're afraid to form a union. They're afraid to change jobs. So it's a lot about power, the power that workers have. Okay, so I think I should move now to talking about what we can do about this. I painted a very grim picture, and I don't want you all to leave being too depressed. But of course, there's no simple answer. Employers and governments have coordinated attacks against workers and workers' organizations for decades in many different dimensions: trade policy, immigration policy, wage standards, labor law. So obviously it's going to take a coordinated and extensive response in return. And I think we need to fight on multiple fronts. There's no one policy that can fix this. We might be able to raise the minimum wage, but if workers don't have enough hours, it doesn't matter. Or if they don't have their laws enforced, it doesn't matter. And that's one of the things I learned in my dissertation here was we can pass living wage laws, but many cities won't enforce them. And they won't enforce them on their own unless workers and workers' organizations are forcing them to implement the laws. So I think what this all points to is that workers need stronger organization and more security to pass policies and get those policies enforced. So it's going to require all of these things: minimum wages, earned income tax credits, more education and training that's targeted to job growth, creating career ladders. I think really what we need to do is not be afraid to experiment. We need to experiment with new policies, new strategies, new forms of worker organization. And we need to be able to take big risks. And unfortunately, I don't think we can do it without taking risks. But I think that also means we have to be prepared to fail. And in fact, if we look back to the history of social movements, all social movements are really comprised of a lot of failure. And ideally, what we can do is convert those to what Eve Weinbaum calls successful failures. We are going to lose most of the campaigns we wage. But ideally, the ones that we can build on, that we can create new capacity, are the ones that succeed in building longer-term movements. Those are the ones that develop workers as leaders, that develop people as not as victims, but thinking of themselves as political agents who aren't victims of a labor market, but who can actually make choices, that are campaigns that are helping people see the larger political context, that it's, we're fighting here on the minimum wage, but that's connected to our trade policy. Or we're fighting to keep our public sector alive, and that's connected to immigration. And we also need to think about taking on the struggles that build our capacity, our organizations for working people and citizens. Okay, so there's a few interesting ways. I could actually list lots, and I feel like actually right now is a pretty exciting time. Lots of experimentation, lots of risks. In a couple places around the world, we can learn from people who are actually challenging the antitrust laws. They're challenging Walmart. We have an international coalition of farmers and workers who are trying to keep Walmart out of certain countries using competitions laws. In the United Kingdom, they had a ruling against 4 supermarkets who they found are dominating markets, and so they're putting a public ombudsperson in place to oversee contracts between those supermarkets and agricultural suppliers in other countries. And what's important about that is it's asserting that the public has an interest in this. The public has an interest in the relationships between their supermarkets and the farmers in other countries. In terms of wage standards, it's not enough just to raise wages, but we need to build capacities of worker organizations that enforce those. So in some of the living wage ordinances, some of the minimum wage cases, we're getting demands of nonprofit organizations that have the right to go into workplaces and talk to workers about their rights, educate them about the laws, and also file grievances on their behalf if workers are afraid of retaliation. So how can we build these capacities where people can be enforcing the laws and not just relying on governments that have been defunded? We're also seeing new models or reinventing models of collective bargaining. They involve unions, but they go beyond unions, and they involve non-union workers, and sometimes going across borders. There's a project called the Asia Floor Wage, which is trying to bring together worker NGOs and unions across Asia saying we don't want to be competing against each other. We don't want our wages driving each other down and workers and employers threatening to move. So we want to engage in collective bargaining together around a common methodology for determining wages. And we also see the emergence of Walmart supply chain bargaining, of people saying, hey, look, what Walmart does with its retail workers here in the US is also relevant for what it's doing with its suppliers in other countries. And I should mention today is the 1-year anniversary of the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh, one of the biggest industrial disasters in history. There are activists today that are protesting throughout the US at Walmart to demand that Walmart take accountability for that action. Workers still have no compensation for that, even though they were producing many garments for US manufacturers. So linking these campaigns across countries and throughout supply chains, bargaining in a way that goes to the top of where the money and power is, moving it down the supply chain. And then finally, I think looking at some of the strikes we've seen throughout the US, but out throughout the world, increasing in general strikes, increasing in strikes, even workers that don't have the right to strike, but making bold demands saying, hey, look, your laws have been changed to make it illegal for us to exercise our basic rights. These are our rights. We don't care what your laws say. We're changing the framework of this debate. We're asserting that we have rights. We're demanding $15 an hour. We're going to take this to another level of debate, and we're not going to let the employers control. Okay, so I should wrap up here by just saying, I think that low-wage work is not just about workers at the margins. It really is not going to be solved by a technical fix or one policy. Rather, we need to see low-wage work as emblematic of our entire labor market and, in fact, our entire economy. I think that ultimately the struggle for raising wages, the struggle for a living wage, it's not just about the wage level. I don't think we should get stuck on the wage level itself, but we need to make it a demand for a more just, a more democratic world, one that really puts workers and workers' rights at the center. So thank you very much. Well, first of all, actually, I think the conservative argument should be, well, conservatives don't want to provide food stamps, so it's that we have had conservatives argue for higher minimum wages because they think, okay, it's not great that we're subsidizing all these people through government programs, but my answer would be that I think that these programs combine as complements and not substitutes. Ideally, people would want to have their own income to make their own decisions about how to spend it. There are innovative ideas that I've learned from people like Eric about basic income grants that would actually just give people across the board, all adults, amount of money that they get to decide how they spend it. You could say this is more democratic. It has less constraints about telling people what to do, less of a nanny state and so forth about what food you can buy. But until we get to that point, I think that we need to think of things like minimum wage and earned income tax credits as complementary. The earned income tax credit really is a subsidy to low-wage employers. It allows employers to continue paying low wages and sending their workers off to apply for Medicaid and food stamps. So I think we do want to be advocating for a higher wage. But I think a lot of these other policies are helpful for workers. They depend on them to live, but even as a package, they're just bringing people barely up to a poverty level.
That type of institution still in place.
Right, that's a great point, that there are groups that are still getting sub-minimum wage. Also restaurant workers, for that, tip workers for that matter, and in some places younger workers. The Retail Action Project, a lot of these workers are telling us that the retailers are bringing in disabled workers, that the retail workers are then being asked to do their jobs for them. So it's all around kind of a messed up problem. So I think what they're hoping to do is raise the floor for everybody in a way that kind of still protects people from, allows them to maintain their jobs. I can't actually see very well. Oh yeah, sorry, yeah. I mean, one thing that I think, what we know from social movement history is in part that conditions can change very rapidly. And even just with you all doing fast food strikes, I find it stunning to see how quickly the conversation has changed about minimum wage and wage levels. We've been trying to fight for higher minimum wages for years. And even Obama came in saying that he supported $10 an hour, and then he went down to $9, and then it wasn't going to happen at all. Suddenly, it's back on the table, and states are doing much higher, and cities are doing much higher. And I think, and all of the people I know who work on minimum wage nationally credit it almost entirely to fast food strikes, Walmart strikes, and Occupy movement. So it wasn't coming from legislators. It wasn't even coming from researchers. It was coming from people taking to the streets and demanding higher wages and saying, hey, we're not going to be constrained by what you say is possible. So I think to keep doing what you're doing is one of the strategies that I think that will work, that will change the conversation and suddenly make things seem more possible than that they seemed possible. And to be honest, I think that our unions are really constrained. They have more restrictions on them than just about any other organization or person in society. So union leaders themselves have legal obligations and restrictions that keep them in place. And I think that those of us who are allies of the labor movement and allies of working people can take greater risks than union leaders can. So we can't also necessarily wait for the union leaders to do it. I think many of them are eager for groups like Occupy and so forth to take leadership. And the last time I was here in Madison was actually, I came during 2011. I was following what was going on, and I just went and bought a plane ticket and just flew out here. And I remember Jim Kavanaugh saying that when Rich Trumka came out, he said, hey, look, let's just let the workers lead here. Like, the workers have been taking the lead, let's let them lead and we'll follow. And I think that that's a little bit what we need to do, is we can't necessarily wait for our leadership to lead. We need to be creative and take the risks and be innovative. I'll repeat the question of, if we raise wages, will it actually hurt low-income shoppers, and will it push jobs overseas? We did some research on looking at what would happen if Walmart raised its wages here in the US for retail workers up to $12.50, and it amounted to, I think, a total of about $8 extra or $10 extra total per year for the average Walmart shopper. It's very small, even if it was entirely passed on to the shopper. So I think the argument that it's a Walmart consumer versus a Walmart worker isn't really a solid, strong, because also a lot of Walmart shoppers are also Walmart workers. So even if it was passed on entirely, and we don't think it has to be, it'd be pretty small for the average Walmart shopper. Now, when you talk about raising wages for Walmart producers around the world, you start to get into larger numbers, and you start to, you start to see a concern. So I've been doing a lot of work in Asia where, workers will say, hey, look, if we move, when we're raising our wages in China, aren't our jobs going to go to Vietnam? If we raise our wages in Vietnam, aren't they going to move to Pakistan? So that's partly what the Asia floor wage is trying to do, is to say, hey, let's find ways to not let employers pit us against one another. Let's try and coordinate wage demands. And so actually one of the, the lowest wage in the world, Bangladesh, which has, been trying to make this argument for 30 years. They've been trying to say we're competing on the basis of our low-wage labor. That's what we have to offer 30 years later, and we still have miserable, terrible conditions, the lowest wages in the world. It kind of highlights the fact that we can't just continue down that path of saying, hey, look, we can't raise our wages or jobs will go overseas. It's just at some point, it's not a sustainable model. So I agree, we can't solve it one workplace at one workplace. It needs to be a larger collective response. But I actually don't think we have to pit shoppers against workers.